Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The rain hadn't stopped pouring when Amarachi stepped off the rusty pickup truck that dropped her outside Chief Obina's mansion gates. Her thin slippers were soaked through, her blue wrapper stuck to her legs, and the small gotta-must-go bag on her shoulder was the last physical memory of the home her father built with love. After his sudden death, everything crumbled. Her stepmother, cold and calculating, sold their only piece of land and forced Amarachi out, accusing her of being a burden. Left with nothing but her survival instinct, Amarachi took the first job she could find. As a maid in a house she'd only heard of in whispers, a mansion where no one smiled and rumors floated like shadows about a crippled child and a grieving man who spoke to no one. Her hands trembled not from cold, but from the fear of what waited beyond the iron gates. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was just as she feared, vast, cold, and filled with the echo of emptiness. The other maids, especially Chioma and Blessing, made it clear from the start that Amarachi was beneath them. They mocked her accent, her village clothes, the roughness of her hands. But Amarachi was used to being ignored, and humiliation didn't bother her as much as hunger and hopelessness did. She scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and kept her head down, careful never to speak unless spoken to. The only thing she truly feared was making a mistake that would get her thrown out. This house was her only chance at shelter, and she could not afford to lose it. Yet every night as she lay on the cold maid's mattress in the servant quarters, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if she had escaped one form of prison just to enter another. She caught glimpses of Chief Obina once or twice, a tall, dark-skinned man with graying temples and tired eyes. He hardly spoke. When he did, it was to issue curt instructions or ask about his son, Chimika. Amarachi heard the whispers. The boy had once been joyful, full of life, until a car crash left him in a wheelchair. Since then, he'd shut out the world. No maid was allowed near him unless summoned. Therapists came and went. Nurses quit. Even Genevieve, the boy's stepmother, barely entered his room. Amarachi could only imagine the pain behind those locked doors. And yet, something about that child's isolation stirred something deep inside her, something she herself recognized. It was the feeling of being abandoned while still alive. Chief Obina stood by the large glass window in his study, staring out into the rain-soaked garden. The world outside was lush and green, but all he saw was gray. Grief clung to him like an unwanted shadow. Ever since the accident that took away his wife and left his son crippled, time had become irrelevant. He no longer cared about boardroom victories or expanding his empire, not when his only child looked at him with eyes empty of life. Chimika had once been the very reason Obina built everything. Now the boy barely spoke. The silence between father and son grew heavier with each passing day, like a rope tightening around Obina's chest. He'd hired the best doctors, flown in therapists, even paid one to stay in the mansion for months, all to no avail. Nothing worked. Nothing reached the boy. He had married Genevieve 2 years after the accident, more out of loneliness than love. She was beautiful, polished, and came from a respectable family. At first, he thought her presence might bring light into the mansion again. But it didn't take long before he realized she cared more for appearances than people. She smiled when people were watching and frowned when they weren't. She rarely sat with Chimika, let alone asked how he felt. And though she played the part of the supportive wife in public, Obina saw through her performance. She detested the boy's condition and avoided him like a curse. But he was too tired to fight, too tired to argue. He simply allowed her to decorate the mansion while his son withered upstairs, locked in a silent world no one could enter. Every night, Chief Obina walked past Chimika's door and paused. Sometimes he pressed his palm against it, whispering the boy's name. Other times, he walked away before the pain made him crumble. He remembered the sound of Chimika's laughter, the boy's fascination with puzzles and stories about animals. Now all of that had been replaced by a vacant stare, his body slumped in a wheelchair, his spirit broken. Obina blamed himself. He had been driving that night. He swerved too late. His wife died on the spot. Chimika survived, but at a cruel cost. That guilt followed him everywhere. The staff respected him, feared him even. But no one loved him anymore. And perhaps, he thought bitterly, he didn't deserve to be loved. The room where Chimika stayed was bright, painted with warm colors, and filled with expensive toys no one touched. But it was also lifeless, like a beautiful prison. The boy sat by the window every day, his small frame slouched in the wheelchair, hands resting quietly in his lap. At 10 years old, Chimika had the sharp mind of someone older, but the weight of grief had stolen the sparkle in his eyes. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was usually in whispers to himself. Nurses tried to engage him with games, puzzles, videos, but he ignored them all. Some even tried to bribe him with sweets or books. Nothing worked. He only stared out of the window, eyes fixed on the same corner of the garden where the car had flipped that rainy night. The memory was branded into his soul. Genevieve would occasionally step into the room, clicking her heels on the tiled floor, smiling wide and artificial. She'd say, "Hello, darling," then immediately talk about how stressful her day was or how bored she felt. Sometimes she scolded him for not responding. One time, she screamed and told him to stop acting like he was the only one who lost someone. After that, he never looked at her again. The staff whispered that Genevieve didn't want him to recover, that she wished he'd been sent to a private facility far away. But Chief Obinna wouldn't allow it. He couldn't. This child was all he had left, even if he didn't know how to reach him anymore. The boy's meals were placed by his bedside, but most were returned untouched. He'd pick at food with disinterest, pushing it around his plate or throwing it into the bin when no one was watching. The head maid, Madame Ifioma, scolded the kitchen staff for wasting food, but no one dared report the boy. Everyone in the mansion walked on eggshells around him. He was both sacred and sorrowful. But Chimika didn't care what anyone thought. The only thing he missed was kindness, the kind his real mother used to give him. The way she touched his face and told him stories. Now all he had was silence until a certain quiet maid with soft hands and sad eyes began sneaking past the door at night, and changed everything. Amarachi hadn't planned to enter the forbidden wing. That night, the rain returned with vengeance, battering the roof of the mansion like angry fists. Most of the staff had gone to sleep after the evening routine, and the lights had dimmed. Amarachi, tasked with taking out the kitchen trash, had passed by the corridor that led to Chimika's room. She paused when she heard a faint, dry cough, followed by a low, pained moan. Something about it stirred something deep inside her, a haunting familiarity. She turned back toward the kitchen, tried to mind her business, but her feet refused to obey. She couldn't shake the thought of a helpless child sitting in that grand room, suffering alone. In her own childhood, she had often cried alone in the dark, her mother long gone, her stepmother indifferent. The pain of loneliness was one Amarachi knew too well. Without a plan, she picked up a small bowl of leftover jollof rice, wrapped it with cloth, and tiptoed down the hallway, praying no one would catch her. She found the door slightly ajar. The room was warm, too neat, too still. Chimika sat in his wheelchair by the window, facing away from her. The tray from earlier, untouched, sat on the bedside table. He didn't turn around when she entered. Amarachi stood there for a moment, heart pounding. "Good evening, sir," she whispered, unsure if he'd hear or care. No response. Carefully, she approached, her voice trembling as she added, "I brought you something else. Not from the big kitchen, for mine." The boy didn't move. Gently, Amarachi placed the bowl in her lap and sat beside him on the carpet. She began to eat, deliberately exaggerating how tasty it was. "You don't know what you're missing," she said with a smile. Then, casually, she scooped a spoonful and held it out to him. Silence. Then, slowly, he turned his head, just slightly, and opened his mouth. Amarachi froze in disbelief. Carefully, she fed him. He chewed without emotion, but he chewed. And in that moment, something broke between them. Not pain, not fear. Something tender, a shared understanding between two souls abandoned in different ways. As she fed him, she began to speak. Not loudly, not in any formal tone, just quiet, heart-spoken words. She told him about how her stepmother used to hide food from her, about how she and her little brother once drank water mixed with sugar as dinner. She didn't expect him to respond, but she saw his eyes blink rapidly. His lips twitched, not in a smile, but as if something inside him wanted to escape. When the bowl was empty, Amarachi reached into her wrapper and pulled out a small drawing her late father once made for her. "This helped me when I couldn't sleep," she said, placing it on his desk. "It's not much, but it kept me company when the world was cruel." Chimika didn't say a word, but his eyes followed her as she stood to leave. That night he didn't cry, and for the first time in weeks he didn't toss the food tray onto the floor. The mansion was unusually quiet that night. Chief Obinna had been restless, as usual, walking the hallways after dismissing his security update. The board meeting earlier that day had left a sour taste in his mouth. Aggressive investors, poor quarterly projections, but none of it compared to the torment inside his own home. He had passed by Chimika's wing countless times without entering. The guilt of seeing his son in that condition, the wheelchair, the blank stare, it haunted him. But tonight, something stopped him as he neared the hallway. He heard a voice, soft, feminine, speaking in low tones that didn't sound like a nurse or therapist. Curious and concerned, he walked toward the door and stood beside it, shielded in shadow. The voice grew clearer. It was a maid. She was feeding his son and telling stories. Stories filled with poverty, sadness, and raw truth. But more shocking than her presence was Chimika's reaction. Obinna didn't hear shouting. He didn't hear silence. He heard chewing. Chimika was eating. Chief Obinna's heart thudded in disbelief. His first instinct was to barge in, to reprimand her for entering without permission, to demand how she bypassed protocol. But something, perhaps the rawness in her voice or the way she patiently spoke to his son without expectation, stopped him. Through the slight crack in the door, he saw them. The maid sat cross-legged on the floor beside Chimika, gently feeding him spoon after spoon of simple rice, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. No formalities, no medical jargon, just human presence. The boy didn't resist. He looked tired, but less distant. There was no pretense, no pressure, just a fragile thread of connection being woven between a broken child and a forgotten maid. Obinna stepped back into the shadows, deeply shaken. He returned to his room without a word. That night, Chief Obinna couldn't sleep. He paced for hours, hands behind his back, mind racing. He had spent millions on doctors, therapists, treatments, and medications. All failed. Yet this young girl, a maid he barely remembered hiring, had cracked something open with nothing but honesty and presence. Obinna didn't know whether to feel grateful or ashamed. How had he missed it? How had everyone missed it? The next morning, he called his chief of staff and asked who Amarachi was. The file said, 24 years old, no higher education, recommended by local priest, village of Izayama. Nothing remarkable on paper. But what she did last night had been nothing short of miraculous. And while Obinna said nothing to her, he watched her more closely after that, and in doing so, began to witness his son's slow, silent return to life. The morning sun filtered through Chimika's curtains, casting soft gold streaks across the floor. Amarachi hesitated outside the door, unsure if she'd be allowed in again. But before she could knock, she heard his voice, soft, fragile, but unmistakably clear. Amarachi. Her heart caught in her throat. She opened the door slowly. There he was, eyes wide open, seated in his wheelchair with a blanket over his legs. "You came back," he whispered. Amarachi stepped in, holding another bowl. This time, hot yam porridge she had begged the kitchen maid to let her prepare herself. She smiled warmly. "I told you I would," she replied. She sat on the floor again, just like before, and resumed the quiet routine they had unknowingly created. But this time, something was different. The boy looked at her, really looked at her, and there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. As she fed him, he asked her a question. "The first in months. Was your father kind?" Amarachi paused, surprised, then nodded. "He was the kindest man I knew. He used to carry me on his back when I was too tired to walk. Chimika said nothing for a moment, then murmured, "My mom used to sing to me. Every night, before bed." His voice cracked. Amarachi gently placed a spoon down and held his hand, careful not to startle him. "Tell me about her," she said. And he did. Slowly, in broken phrases, he spoke about his mother's laughter, her smell, the bedtime stories she read, the way she braided his hair when he was younger. Amarachi listened, never interrupting. When the word stopped, she told him her own stories again. And somewhere in that exchange, in the space where grief met grace, a new bond formed. Not just between a maid and a boy, but between two people who had suffered quietly for too long. Meanwhile, Chief Obinna stood once again in the hallway, unseen. He listened as his son spoke about his mother, something he hadn't done in over a year. His throat tightened. He wanted to go in, to hug his child, to cry, to apologize for every day he had let that silence grow between them. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he turned away quietly and walked down the hall with tears gathering in his eyes. For the first time in months, he dared to hope. Chimika was coming back to him, not because of wealth or medicine, but because of a maid the world ignored. And Chief Obinna knew, in that moment, that Amarachi was no ordinary girl. She was light, a light that no one saw coming. Genevieve stood at the balcony of her private suite, a tall glass of rose in her hand, her eyes fixed on the garden below. The wind tousled her long Brazilian weave as her manicured nails tapped restlessly against the stem of the glass. She had noticed it, the subtle shift in the house. The way Chief Obinna had begun lingering around the corridors. The rare sound of Chimika's voice echoing softly from his room. The gentle smile that had returned to his lips. At first, Genevieve was mildly intrigued, then annoyed. And when she discovered the cause was none other than that lowly village girl with tribal marks and worn-out slippers, her annoyance turned to fury. Amarachi had not only crossed boundaries, but was being allowed to do so. The other maids whispered too much about her now, saying she had a gift, that the boy loved her like a sister. Genevieve knew how dangerous that kind of influence could become, especially in a house where power was currency. She called Blessing and Chioma, the two senior maids who had always craved her approval, and invited them for a private chat in her sitting room. The air was thick with fake perfumes and forced laughter as she served them drinks, pretending to be generous. Then she began to probe. "That Amarachi girl," she said casually. "Has she been doing what I think she's been doing? Sneaking around the boy?" The maids nodded eagerly, eager to spill gossip. Chioma even added her own spice, claiming she once saw Amarachi alone in the kitchen late at night, mixing something suspicious in a pot. Genevieve's smile never faltered, but inside her venom brewed. She instructed them to keep watching Amarachi and report every move. If she was to remove this nuisance, she needed evidence. Real or fabricated, it didn't matter. The goal was to eliminate Amarachi before she grew roots too deep to pull out. Later that evening, Genevieve approached Amarachi herself. Her words were laced with passive aggression, her tone wrapped in a fake smile. "You seem to be enjoying your duties more than necessary," she said. Amarachi, caught off guard, bowed respectfully and responded with caution. "I only do what the house requires, Ma." Genevieve's eyes narrowed. "Just remember your place. You are a maid, not a therapist, not a nurse, and certainly not family." The word stung, but Amarachi nodded silently and walked away. But in her heart, she felt something stir, not fear, but a quiet warning. Genevieve was watching her now, and though Amarachi had no desire to compete for anyone's attention, she knew her presence in Chimika's life had upset the fragile balance of the mansion. What she didn't realize yet was how far Genevieve was willing to go to protect her illusion of control, even if it meant destroying her entirely. Chief Obinna sat alone in his study that night, a glass of whiskey untouched by his side, staring at an old family photo, one taken before the accident, before the sorrow, before the mansion turned cold. In it, he stood with his late wife on one side, Chimika between them, smiling with both hands gripping a toy airplane. Back then, Obinna was a different man. Alive, joyful, driven not just by wealth, but by the family he cherished. But that night, the rainy night that stole everything, haunted him like a shadow that clung too tightly to the soul. He remembered gripping the wheel, his wife's soft voice beside him, Chimika humming in the back seat. He remembered the blinding headlights, the screech of tires, the way the world turned sideways. He remembered his wife's last gasp, the blood pooling near her head, and Chimika's silent body slumped in the wreckage. He remembered screaming her name, shaking her, pleading. But death didn't listen. And since then, neither did his son. 4 months after the accident, Obinna had poured every ounce of his wealth into Chimika's recovery. He flew in doctors from abroad, bought the best wheelchairs, renovated the house, and created a healing room filled with light, art, and custom-built therapy tools. But none of it brought his son back. Chimika shut down completely. Wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond. And Obinna, once a man who commanded boardrooms and influenced entire industries, found himself helpless in front of a child. He watched as nurses came and left. Therapists tried and failed. And Genevieve, the woman he had married in desperation to fill a void, offered nothing but surface-level support and public smiles. The real burden, the emotional weight, was his alone to carry. But he carried it silently, burying himself in work, ignoring the boy's pain because facing it meant facing his own failure. Now, as he watched Chimika slowly respond to Amarachi, that poor maid with no education, no medical training, no polished accent, Obinna felt both awe and shame. How could she reach his son with nothing but kindness, when all his riches had failed? That afternoon, after watching from the hallway again, he had approached Amarachi privately. It was the first time they spoke properly. His voice had been low, gravelly, with guilt. "Thank you for not giving up on him," he'd said. Amarachi, startled, had bowed quickly. "I didn't do much, sir. He just needed someone to listen." Obinna's eyes had moistened. Those words pierced deeper than any diagnosis. And though he didn't say it aloud, he began to realize something profound, that perhaps healing didn't always come from doctors or medicine. Sometimes it came from shared pain, from presence, and from people the world was too proud to notice. Genevieve's rage simmered like boiling oil beneath a fragile lid of civility. The more she watched the boy laugh at Amarachi's stories and reach for her hand during breakfast, the more furious she became. It wasn't just jealousy, it was fear. She had built her position in this house with careful manipulation. When she married Chief Obinna, it wasn't out of love, but strategy. She knew his heart was vulnerable, cracked open by grief, and she played the perfect companion. Elegant, poised, supportive. She had no intention of raising a crippled boy or becoming a mother figure to anyone. Her plan had been simple: charm Obinna, secure her social status, and let the boy fade quietly into the background. But now, that maid was ruining everything. The boy was alive again. The father was engaged. And the power Genevieve once held so effortlessly was beginning to slip through her fingers. She called her cousin, Dara, a sly street-smart woman who had once helped her in a past scandal. They met at an upscale salon downtown. Over hair dryers and whispered tones, Genevieve explained her problem. "She's winning the boy, and Obinna's starting to see it. I need her gone, but cleanly." Dara smirked, tossing her braids over one shoulder. "Frame her. Theft. Insubordination. Make it look like she's manipulating the boy to get favor." Genevieve's eyes lit up. That was exactly the plan. Back at the mansion, she began spreading rumors through the staff. She told Madame Ifioma that Amarachi had been caught near the master's study. She hinted to the driver that Amarachi had eyes for the boss. She even planted an earring inside Obinna's room, one identical to Amarachi's, and made sure it was accidentally discovered. Slowly, doubt began to creep through the household like poison in a well. But what Genevieve hadn't expected was Chimika's resistance. When the head maid suggested Amarachi be reassigned to kitchen duty due to overstepping boundaries, the boy refused to eat again. He cried until Amarachi was brought back. He even whispered to Obinna one morning, "Don't let them take her away." That single sentence sent shock waves through the house. Genevieve pretended to be supportive in front of Obinna, claiming the staff were misunderstanding her intentions, but inside she seethed. Amarachi had become a threat, not just emotionally but symbolically. She represented everything Genevieve was not: genuine, loving, selfless. And worse, she was winning the heart of the one person who still held power over the mansion: the boy. As Genevieve retreated to her room that evening, she realized this wouldn't be a subtle war anymore. If Amarachi was to be destroyed, it would have to be total. And she would make sure it happened soon. The air in the mansion had grown tense. The once peaceful bond Amarachi shared with Chimika now felt like a battlefield under siege. She noticed the shift, the sharp stares from other maids, the whispers that stopped when she entered the kitchen, the way Blessing would smirk when passing her in the hallway. The lies were spreading fast. First, it was murmured that she had bewitched the boy. Then came rumors that she was seducing Chief Obinna. Amarachi, despite her gentle nature, could feel the claws of resentment tightening around her. She did her best to ignore it, focusing on her tasks and remaining devoted to Chimika. But when Madame Ifioma summoned her one morning and said she was being removed from her duties with the boy and reassigned to laundry, Amarachi knew the war had reached her doorstep. Her heart sank. She pleaded gently, "Please, Ma, he needs me." But the head maid shook her head with mock sympathy. "It's not about what he needs. It's about what's appropriate." That afternoon, Chimika refused to eat again. When the new caregiver brought in his lunch, he turned his wheelchair away and ignored her. He didn't say a word, but his eyes welled with tears. Amarachi watched from a distance, her hands trembling as she folded clothes. The boy she had helped bring back to life was slipping again, all because of lies she couldn't defend herself against. She considered sneaking into his room that night, but she knew the consequences could be severe. Genevieve was waiting for one wrong move, and this time Obinna might believe her. That evening, as Amarachi walked past the corridor, she heard the soft sound of Chimika sobbing. It broke her. She returned to the servants' quarters, fell to her knees beside her mattress, and wept into her wrapper. Not for herself, but for a child she didn't birth, but loved as if he had come from her own womb. She didn't need to be his mother to feel the pain of being separated from him. That night she made a vow. If suffering in silence meant protecting him, then she would endure it. The next day, Chimika did something no one expected. As his father entered the room to greet him before a business trip, Chimika looked at him squarely and said, "I want Amarachi back, or I won't eat. I won't talk. I won't smile." Obinna was stunned. It was the longest sentence the boy had said to him in over a year. At first he thought it was an emotional threat, but then he saw the resolve in the child's eyes. That same evening, Obinna called Amarachi to his private study. She walked in slowly, unsure of what to expect. He gestured for her to sit. "Did you tell Chimika to say that?" he asked. Amarachi shook her head quickly. "No, sir. I haven't even seen him." Obinna stared at her for a long moment. Then, in a softer voice, he said, "He cried for you, defended you. You've done something none of us could." For the first time, Amarachi's eyes met his, not as a maid, but as a woman who had fought in silence for a child no one else could reach. She said nothing more, and in that silence, Obinna heard something deeper than words: sacrifice. The morning sunlight crept into Chief Obinna's study as he stared out of the window, Amarachi's quiet face still fresh in his mind from their conversation the night before. Something about her demeanor, the calm humility, the way she held her hands, the sadness beneath her eyes, gnawed at him. She wasn't just a random village girl, he thought. There was more to her story. After speaking with Chimika again, who repeatedly insisted he only wanted Amarachi and no one else, Obinna decided to personally look into her background. He called his private investigator and requested a discreet background check. Later that evening, he received a file with old parish records from her village. What he found inside left him stunned. A priest's handwritten note about a young girl named Amarachi who had rescued a child from a car crash years ago near Izayama Junction. The note mentioned the child was paralyzed, and the girl, believed to be no more than 17 at the time, had stayed with the boy until help arrived, even though she was injured herself. It had been written off as village gossip then, But now it made perfect sense. Chief Obinna closed the file slowly, his throat tightening. Could it be true? Could this girl have saved Chimika once before? He remembered the crash well, how his son had been dragged out from the wreckage, placed gently on a leaf mat by a crying teenage girl, according to the driver. At the time, in the confusion of paramedics and chaos, Obinna had never found that girl. Now, years later, she was standing in his mansion, feeding his son, healing him in ways no doctor could. It felt like fate had brought her back, like God had given him another chance to see what he missed the first time. That evening, Obinna summoned Amarachi again. He didn't accuse or interrogate her. He simply asked, "Do you remember the crash on Izayama Road years ago?" Amarachi's eyes darkened with pain. She nodded slowly. "I was walking home from the stream when I heard it. I saw the boy bleeding, crying alone. I didn't know he'd be here one day, sir. I just couldn't leave him." Obinna said nothing. He simply bowed his head, overwhelmed with a guilt he hadn't realized he carried. From that night on, everything changed between them. Amarachi was reinstated as Chimika's primary caretaker, but now with Obinna's full blessing. The staff watched in quiet awe as the billionaire began to show her a rare kind of respect, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably real. He offered her better meals, a cleaner room, and assigned her fewer chores. Genevieve watched with rising dread as Obinna and Amarachi shared more moments, quiet nods, meaningful glances, respectful silences. But Amarachi remained grounded. She never overstepped, never demanded more than she was given. She still served water with both hands, bowed respectfully, and avoided gossip. But beneath the humble exterior, something powerful was growing. Her purpose. She had once saved Chimika from physical death. Now, she was saving him emotionally. And Chief Obinna, the man who once saw her as a maid, was beginning to see her as something far more valuable. Genevieve had always prided herself on being untouchable. For years, she had curated an image of elegance, prestige, and grace, a woman who looked perfect in public and maintained quiet dominance behind closed doors. She never raised her voice unless it benefited her performance. She never argued unless the audience favored her. But now, the cracks in her facade were widening. Obinna was changing, subtly at first, then noticeably. He began missing dinners she arranged, canceling outings she planned, and asking questions that felt uncomfortably probing. "Why don't you spend more time with Chimika?" he asked once. She had laughed it off. "Darling, the boy needs space. I'm not trained in therapy." But Obinna had said nothing and simply walked away. She could feel him slipping, emotionally, mentally, perhaps even physically. And the worst part was, it was all because of a maid. A village girl who had no makeup, no heels, and no pedigree. One afternoon, Genevieve walked into the sitting room and found Obinna and Amarachi seated opposite each other, discussing Chimika's progress. Amarachi was holding a hand-drawn chart showing the boy's eating patterns and moods. Obinna nodded attentively, even smiled. Genevieve froze. That smile had once belonged to her. Now it was being given to someone who didn't even know how to use cutlery properly. She interrupted the moment with a sharp tone. "Obinna, I need to speak with you. Privately." Amarachi stood to leave, but Obinna gently held up his hand. "One moment, Amarachi." That one gesture shattered Genevieve's pride. After Amarachi left, she confronted him with venom disguised as concern. "You're letting that girl manipulate you. Open your eyes. She's using the boy to gain favor." Obinna's face darkened. "And what exactly are you using to keep my favor, Genevieve?" "Silence? Distance." She was stunned. It was the first time he'd ever questioned her with such cold clarity. From that moment forward, Genevieve knew she was losing. Obinna no longer looked at her with admiration, only indifference. Chimika refused to even acknowledge her presence. And Amarachi was becoming the heart of the home. But Genevieve wasn't the type to go down quietly. As she retreated to her bedroom that night, she stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. Her makeup flawless, her jewelry glinting under the chandelier, her posture elegant. But none of it mattered anymore. Power was shifting. And it wasn't happening in the boardroom or the bedroom. It was happening in the quiet spaces, in a child's healing laughter, in a man's humbled gratitude, in a maid's quiet strength. Genevieve clenched her jaw. If she couldn't beat Amarachi with charm, she would destroy her with something far more effective: lies. The mornings in the mansion were no longer cloaked in silence and sorrow. For the first time in over a year, laughter could be heard, soft, hesitant at first, but growing in confidence like a forgotten melody rediscovered. Chimika had transformed. He still sat in his wheelchair, but his shoulders were no longer slouched with hopelessness. He looked people in the eyes now. He ate full meals, cracked jokes, and even asked to be pushed around the garden in the evenings. And at the center of this miracle was Amarachi. Their bond had become undeniable, not just to Obinna, but to everyone who worked in the house. The boy clung to her like she was a sister, a mother, and a friend rolled into one. Every drawing he made, every story he wrote, every song he hummed, Amarachi was in them. He asked her to read to him at night. He asked for her before sleep. If anyone else tried to feed him, he turned his head away. Chief Obinna noticed this transformation and watched Amarachi closely, not with suspicion, but reverence. He admired the way she never sought attention, never claimed credit. Even when the staff whispered about her growing influence, she remained humble, cleaning, serving, and slipping away when praise came near. He once asked her, during a quiet moment on the veranda, "Why do you do it?" Her answer was simple: "Because someone once saved me with kindness. I want to pass it on." That sentence stayed with Obinna for days. He began inviting her to sit in on Chimika's medical consultations. He valued her input, and though Amarachi was uncomfortable at first, she offered her thoughts with grace. What touched him even more was her refusal to accept financial rewards. When he tried to gift her a gold bracelet, she returned it the next day with a bow. "Sir, I didn't come here to collect things. I came here to serve." But even as the bond between Amarachi, Chimika, and Obinna deepened, the mansion simmered with tension beneath its polished floors. The other maids grew resentful, led by Blessing and Chioma, who whispered that Amarachi was playing the long game, a village girl aiming to become the next madam of the house. Genevieve fanned those flames with subtle digs and poisoned words. But none of it reached Amarachi, who remained blissfully unaware, focused entirely on Chimika's progress. One day, as she wheeled the boy around the garden, he looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes and said, "If I had a choice, I'd choose you to be my real mummy." Amarachi froze. Her eyes filled with tears. She knelt beside him, cupped his cheek, and whispered, "You may not have come for me, but you'll always be a part of me." What neither of them knew was that Genevieve stood behind the pillar nearby, listening, and her rage had reached a point of no return. Genevieve could no longer smile through her humiliation. Each day Amarachi remained in that mansion felt like a blade twisting deeper into her pride. She saw the way Obinna's eyes followed the maid with silent approval. She saw how Chimika's face lit up in her presence, how the staff began treating her with a subtle respect usually reserved for her. She felt herself slipping, fading, becoming irrelevant. It was more than she could bear. One night, she sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection through bloodshot eyes. "You can't let her win," she muttered to herself. And that was the moment she made her decision. Amarachi wouldn't just be removed. She would be disgraced. She picked up her phone and dialed her cousin Dara again. "I need you to come over," she whispered. "This time, we're going all the way. I want her out, and I want Obinna to hate her." Dara arrived under the guise of a casual visit. They sat in Genevieve's room and schemed like two seasoned politicians preparing for war. The plan was simple: plant evidence, manipulate perception, and strike while emotions were high. First, they would place an envelope of Obinna's business documents and cash inside Amarachi's room, hidden under her mattress. Second, Dara would leak a fake message, claiming Amarachi had contacted Obinna's business rivals through a stolen email address. Third, they would bribe Chioma and Blessing with money and job opportunities elsewhere if they testified they had witnessed Amarachi sneaking into Obinna's study at night. Genevieve knew Obinna was a man of pride and structure. If he believed Amarachi had compromised his family or business, he would cut her off without blinking. The trap was being set not just to get rid of Amarachi, but to destroy her reputation beyond repair. Within days, the plan was in motion. That weekend, while Amarachi was tending to Chimika in the garden, Chioma slipped into her quarters and slid the planted envelope under the mattress. That night, Dara used a masked email to send a message to one of Obina's top investors, claiming to be Amarachi and requesting sensitive information. The investor flagged the email to Obina's team, and the red alert was triggered. The next morning, Madame Ifeoma, under Genevieve's manipulation, accidentally found the envelope while inspecting the rooms. She called Obina. He arrived, confused but alert. When the documents were found in Amarachi's quarters, his face twisted in disbelief. Amarachi was summoned to the main sitting room where the entire staff, Genevieve, and even Chimika had gathered. Obina held up the envelope, his voice cold and heavy. "Explain this." Amarachi's eyes widened in shock. Her lips trembled. I've never seen that before, sir." But Obina's expression had already changed. The seed of doubt had been planted. Amarachi's voice cracked as she tried to explain herself. Her heart thundered in her chest as she looked at Obina, a man who, for weeks, had begun to treat her with kindness, respect, and even trust. "I swear, sir, I've never touched your files. I've never entered your study," she pleaded. But the silence in the room was suffocating. Genevieve stood with arms folded, her face arranged in an expression of faux concern. "We're all shocked," she said, eyes glinting. "But it's clear someone was trying to manipulate their way into your business." Chioma and Blessing stepped forward like choreographed puppets. "We saw her near the study last week, sir," Blessing said. "And one time she told me the boy was the key to everything," Chioma added. Amarachi turned to them, stunned. "You're lying. Why are you lying?" she cried. But the trap was already closed. The weight of fabricated witnesses and planted evidence was too much. Chimika looked confused and scared. He clutched the arms of his wheelchair and whispered she didn't do it, but his voice was too soft, lost in the chaos. Obina, consumed by disappointment and betrayal, raised his hand. "Enough." His voice silenced the room. He looked at Amarachi, not with anger, but with a pain so sharp it made her chest ache. "I believed in you. I brought you close to my son. And now this." Amarachi fell to her knees, tears pouring down her face. "Sir, please." "I didn't," but he cut her off. "Until I sort this out, you are suspended. Pack your things." Those words hit her like bullets. Chimika screamed, "No. Daddy, no." But Obina was already walking away. Amarachi sobbed silently, her hands gripping her wrapper tightly. The staff began to scatter, murmuring among themselves. Genevieve smiled faintly to herself as she watched the girl crumble. The plan had worked. That night, Amarachi sat in the servants' quarters with her bag beside her, numb and broken. Her belongings had been packed hastily. She hadn't even gotten to say goodbye to Chimika properly. The boy had been whisked away to his room under Genevieve's order, and the guards were instructed not to let her near him. As she sat there in the cold silence, she stared at the same pillow where she had once cried after being hired. Only this time, she wasn't just poor and alone. She was heartbroken and betrayed. She had poured everything into this house, into that boy, into her duties. And now, with one well-planned lie, it had all been taken away. Her hands clenched into fists. The humiliation stung, but the deeper pain was knowing she had lost a child who trusted her, and a man who had finally seen her worth. As the door creaked open and the guard stepped in to escort her out, Amarachi stood slowly, wiping her tears. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She simply looked back at the mansion one last time and walked away in silence. Chimika hadn't spoken to anyone since Amarachi left. The moment the gate closed behind her, something inside him broke. He refused to eat, refused to sleep, refused to respond to the new caregiver who now hovered awkwardly by his side with plastic smiles and empty songs. He sat by the window all day, staring at the garden where Amarachi once wheeled him around. Her absence created a vacuum no one could fill. At night, he cried silently into his pillow, clutching a piece of cloth she once used to wipe his mouth, the only thing he had left of her. The mansion returned to its cold, lifeless state. Obinna noticed the change, but he didn't understand the depth of it. Not until 4 days later, when he returned home from a business trip and found Chimika in the hallway, sitting in his wheelchair, blocking the path to the study. Obinna frowned. "What are you doing here, son? You should be in your room." But Chimika didn't move. His eyes, though swollen from days of crying, stared at his father with a strength Obinna hadn't seen in years. "Daddy," he said slowly, "you made a mistake." Obinna stiffened. "About what?" Chimika's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Amarachi didn't steal anything. She didn't write those emails. She never even went near your study. They're lying. Genevieve, Chioma, all of them, they lied." The words poured from his mouth like water breaking through a dam. "I heard Genevieve talking on the phone with someone the night before Amarachi was called. She said the plan was working. She said Daddy would finally see Amarachi for the manipulator she is. But Amarachi never manipulated me. She saved me. She fed me when no one else cared. She made me feel like I mattered. She didn't deserve what happened." Obinna's breath caught in his throat. He crouched down in front of his son, stunned. "You're sure of this?" Chimika nodded furiously. "She's the only person who didn't treat me like a burden. She made me laugh again. And I hate you for sending her away." The boy's voice broke, and he began to cry. "You always leave me with people who don't care. You always choose the wrong people. And now you hurt the only one who ever saw me." Obinna stood slowly, his heart racing. The shame hit him like a truck. He hadn't believed Amarachi. He hadn't questioned Genevieve. He had simply followed what appeared logical. But now, hearing the truth from his own son, he felt the full weight of his failure. He placed a trembling hand on Chimika's head. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'll make this right." And in that moment, something shifted between father and son, not just the pain of losing someone good, but the resolve to fight to get her back. Chief Obinna sat in his office well into the night, the glow from his laptop screen illuminating the deep furrows on his forehead. The evidence was piling up, and this time it pointed in the opposite direction. He'd begun a full investigation, quietly reviewing security footage, server logs, and the chain of events from the day the forged email was sent. What he discovered shocked him. The IP address used to send the email had been traced to a hotel downtown, one booked under a fake name. But the number listed on the hotel's records matched a burner phone Dara, Genevieve's cousin, had used on previous occasions. Amarachi's name wasn't in any system. Her fingerprints were nowhere near the study. Nothing tied her to the alleged crime, except the envelope which now, under scrutiny, appeared untouched by her hand. Even the cash inside bore no fingerprints. Obinna leaned back in his chair, gripping his temples. He had been played, cruelly, masterfully, by the very people he thought he trusted. He summoned Chioma and Blessing to his study under the guise of routine inquiries. As they stood before him, nervously shifting from foot to foot, he asked the same question. "Are you willing to swear on your life that Amarachi was guilty?" Chioma's lips trembled. Blessing's eyes darted toward the door. Before either could answer, Obinna slammed a folder on the desk, the printout of Genevieve's call records, CCTV footage, and a photo of Dara entering the mansion the week of the framing. "This is your last chance," he said coldly. "Lie to me again, and I'll have you arrested for conspiracy and obstruction." The threat cracked their composure. Blessing broke first, crying and falling to her knees. "She made us do it," she wailed. "Madame Genevieve said we'd get new jobs abroad. She said Amarachi was becoming a threat. She planned everything." Chioma nodded through her tears, adding, "We never thought it would go this far." Obinna didn't react. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the night. So much had been broken: trust, loyalty, dignity. But the worst of all was the betrayal of an innocent soul. That evening he confronted Genevieve. She was lounging in their bedroom, scrolling through her phone, still smug in her belief that the storm had passed. "We need to talk," Obina said flatly. When he laid out the evidence, her demeanor changed. She tried to deny, to deflect, but it was too late. "You were so threatened by Maid," he said, voice trembling with fury, "that you would frame her? Manipulate my son? Endanger my business?" Genevieve scoffed. "That little rat was crawling her way into your heart, into this house, into everything I built with you." Obina stared at her with a disgust he didn't try to hide. "You built nothing," he replied. "This house was already dying when Amarachi walked in, and she brought it back to life." He left her there, alone, seething and powerless. His next move was clear. He had to find Amarachi, and this time not just to apologize, but to give her back everything she had lost, and more. Word spread through the mansion like wildfire. Genevieve had been exposed. The staff whispered in clusters, unable to contain their surprise as Obina gathered everyone in the main sitting room the next morning. For the first time in years, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation, but also tension. Obina stood at the front, Chimika beside him in his wheelchair, holding his father's hand. Genevieve entered the room moments later, her face painted in defiance, but her eyes betrayed the fear hiding underneath. Obina didn't waste time. What happened in this house, the lies, the betrayal, the character assassination of an innocent woman, will not go unpunished, he began. He turned toward Genevieve. "I brought you into my home when I was broken. I gave you trust, position, comfort, and this is what you did in return." Genevieve's nostrils flared. "She was manipulating you. You were too blind to see it." Obina didn't flinch. "The only blind one here was me, until now." He motioned toward the guards. "Escort her to pack her things. She has 20 minutes. After that, she is never to set foot on this property again." The silence that followed was heavy. Genevieve tried to protest, but no one moved. No one defended her. She had burned every bridge, and the fire was hers to walk through now. As she was led away, she turned and locked eyes with Chimika, who simply looked away, disgusted. Blessing and Chioma were suspended immediately. Madame Ifioma was demoted for negligence. Obina meant every word he said about justice. But the most important justice, he knew, was yet to be delivered, the one that belonged to Amarachi. That evening, he instructed his driver to begin searching every corner of Izayama village. "Find her," he said. "I don't care what it costs. Bring her back." Meanwhile, Chimika refused to eat again until Amarachi returned. He left notes under her pillow, drawings on her door, and every night before bed, he whispered into the quiet, "Come back, please." The next day, as Obina sat in his study, his phone buzzed. It was the driver. "Sir," he said, "I found her." Obina stood so quickly he knocked over his chair. "Where?" The driver's voice was emotional. "She's staying in a widow's small hut, sir, teaching her children how to read. She's wearing the same slippers. She cried when I mentioned your name." Obina closed his eyes, his chest tightening. He gave one command. "Tell her I'm coming myself." That night, he left the mansion quietly and drove out into the dark village roads alone. His heart pounded not with pride, but with repentance. He was no longer a billionaire seeking control. He was a father seeking restoration, and a man who owed everything to a girl the world had discarded, but whose worth had changed his world forever. The road into Izayama was rough and unpaved, winding through palm trees and scattered huts. Chief Obina drove himself, dressed in a simple shirt and trousers, no convoy, no staff, just a man carrying the weight of his guilt and the urgency of a father's mission. He reached the widow's compound just as the evening sun dipped behind the trees. The house was modest, mud walls, a zinc roof, and a small open veranda where Amarachi sat, helping 2 children read from torn schoolbooks. Her wrapper was faded, her eyes tired, but she still smiled gently at the children, completely unaware of the approaching figure behind her. Obina stood for a moment, taking it all in, her patience, her grace, the quiet strength she carried even in the midst of pain. Then his voice broke the stillness. "Amarachi," he said. She froze. Slowly, she turned, and when her eyes met his, everything else vanished. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't stand. She didn't run to him or curse him. She simply looked at him, broken but dignified, waiting for what he had to say. Obinna stepped forward, his voice trembling. I failed you. I believed lies over your truth. I hurt you when all you did was give your heart to my son. And to me. He dropped to his knees, the same man who commanded boardrooms, now kneeling before a village girl with dusty feet. I came to ask for your forgiveness, he said. Not as a master, but as a man, as a father, as someone who finally understands what it means to be poor in spirit despite having everything. Amarachi covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then, with her voice cracking, she whispered, I would have died for that boy. You didn't just send me away. You broke his heart. Obinna nodded, unable to meet her gaze. I know, and I'm here to make it right, whatever it takes. Later that evening, Obinna sat with Amarachi under the mango tree in front of the widow's house. He explained everything. The investigation, the confessions, Genevieve's removal, and how Chimika had defended her in front of everyone. He hasn't eaten properly since you left, he said. He thinks you're gone forever. He's been begging me to find you. Amarachi wept, her hands covering her face. I thought I lost him, that I lost everything. Obinna placed a hand gently over hers. Come back with me, but not as a maid, as someone who belongs in our lives. I can't undo the pain I caused, but I can promise you this. You'll never be looked down on again. Not under my roof. Not in my son's eyes. And not in mine. The stars blinked into the sky, one by one, as Amarachi nodded slowly. Not because she wanted revenge, but because her heart, though shattered, still had room to heal and to love again. The return to the mansion was unlike anything the staff had seen before. Amarachi stepped out of the car, dressed not in a maid's uniform, but in a modest, clean white gown that flowed around her feet. Her hair was braided neatly, her face radiant with grace and humility. As she entered through the gates, the guards, once indifferent, stood straighter, nodding with quiet respect. The maids who once mocked her now avoided her eyes, shame burning on their faces. Chimika was in the garden when he saw her. He froze, blinked twice, then shouted, Amarachi, and rolled himself across the lawn as fast as his hands could push. She dropped to her knees and caught him in her arms. He clung to her like a lifeline, sobbing uncontrollably. I knew you'd come back, he cried. I prayed every night. Amarachi kissed his forehead, rocking him like a mother would a newborn. And I heard you, she whispered. I heard every word. Later that evening, Obinna gathered the entire household. The dining room was full, but silent. Everyone could feel something monumental was about to happen. Obinna stood, his voice calm but firm. There is no longer a maid in this house named Amarachi, he began. Murmurs rippled through the staff. He continued, she is no longer under your authority. She is no longer beneath any of you. Today, I recognize her as part of my household. Not because she fed my son, but because she healed him. Not because she served, but because she gave more love than any of us ever did. He turned to Amarachi, who stood quietly at the far end of the room, hands folded respectfully. From this day forward, you will answer to no one here but me, and Chimika, because you are his guardian, and you are my family. The room was stunned into silence. No one spoke, but in Chimika's eyes there was only joy, and in Amarachi's there were tears of grace. That night, Obinna walked into the study, where Amarachi stood by the window. He handed her an envelope. Inside it, the legal papers naming her Chimika's official caregiver and the manager of a new rehabilitation trust fund created in her honor. You deserve this, not as charity, but as justice. Amarachi trembled as she accepted it, overwhelmed. What if people talk? She asked. Let them, Obinna said. They talked when I was rich and my house was empty. Let them talk now that it's full of love. They stood in silence for a while, then Obinna added softly, You gave my son a reason to live. Now let me give you a life where you never have to beg for your worth again. Outside, the mansion glowed, not from lights, but from something it hadn't known in years: peace. And inside that home, where betrayal once ruled, love had finally found its throne, through the hands of a poor maid no one saw coming. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.